This is the day that we take a little bit of a rest at the Milken Institute Global Conference by starting at 8:30 instead of 8 o'clock. So it gave everyone a chance to sleep in. So I hope everyone's well rested and feeling great for the last day of the conference. I wanted to promise everybody that this may be the one panel of the day that is not going to be talking about U.S. presidential politics. But I can't promise that on behalf of my panelists. They may want to be part of that conversation. In fact, we're dealing with a much more important topic, which is the shifting economic power of cities. It's a mega trend. It's something that really is going on, as we know, around the world. And the backdrop for this panel, just to give it a little brief intro in terms of the panel topic, is that cities really are the economic engines that are driving the global economy. The geography of power in the world is shifting as more and more cities are developed and become populous. Many people must live in cities for economic reasons, and many people, most of us, I think, prefer to live in cities for social reasons, if we can. So it's that backdrop and the rise, especially of the so-called mega cities. Just a couple of factoids. By 2025, 136 new cities are expected to enter the top 600 cities in the world in terms of population. And 100 of those are in China alone. So the economic dynamism that's going on in city environments around the world is really the kind of starting point for this panel. And one slide, or kind of a group of slides that I wanted to share, is actually from the Milken Institute's work in regional economics. We do something called the best performing cities each year. We've been doing that for almost 20 years. And if the slide operators, yes, thank you, could show basically the way, and you'll see here basically how cities have developed, the rankings, green being higher, red being a little bit lower, how that has unfolded over the last decade and a half. So kind of the point of this succession of slides is that even in a relatively economically stable country like the US, there's still a lot of dynamism going on, a lot of changes. And one of the things is Californians, the Institute was very happy last December when we announced that the top two cities were, in fact, for at least this year, San Francisco and San Jose. So you see that, and that's partly the rise of tech and the influence of the tech sector in this part of the US. So thank you for the slides. We have a great panel to basically explore these topics. The full biographies of each of these distinguished members of the panel is on the Global Conference app. I encourage you to read those. But I'll just give brief introductions. From my left, your right, Marc Morial is the President and CEO of the National Urban League, former Mayor of New Orleans. Naheed Nenshi is the Mayor of Calgary, Canada. Byron Boston is the President and CEO of Dynex Capital. And Fahad Al-Rashad is the CEO and Managing Director of Emaar Economic City in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So thank you, panelists all. Marc Morial is only going to be able to be with us for about 20 minutes. We rescheduled this panel, and he has a board call at 9 o'clock. He was very kind to still continue to be with us. So I wanted to allow him to speak first and go to him first. And I think actually that's a great way to start because, you know, especially those of us in the U.S., New Orleans is probably, wherever we live, one of our most favorite cities, one of our most beloved cities. And, you know, Marc was one of the most successful mayors of New Orleans. Now he, you know, is heading an institute that's really focused on a very important national organization that's focused on issues of diversity, access, affordability. And so, Marc, if you could bring together kind of both your experiences as mayor, your experiences now, and a little bit, if I can say, the kind of the Katrina question, which is 10 years ago, this horrific storm, a little bit maybe a forerunner of some of the climate change-inspired events that are unfolding in front of our eyes now. Katrina, or New Orleans has rebuilt, it's come back a bit, but there are probably lessons for not just New Orleans, but for the entire world. So
thank you. First of all, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Let me say how honored it is to be here with all of these distinguished panelists. And let me start this way. And first of all, if you didn't make it to New Orleans for Jazz Fest last weekend or the weekend before, there's always next year.
Yeah.
And let me try to create a little bit of context around by starting with Katrina. So 2005, August 29th, this horrific storm takes place. And the storm passes through New Orleans. And after it passes through the city, several hours later, the city is filled with water due to broken levees or failed human infrastructure. So it's very important to understand that the damage that really occurred in New Orleans was occasioned by failed infrastructure, failed flood control systems, failed levees, 4 or 5 levee breaks, which filled the city up with water. Now, what did Katrina do? It challenged this incredibly great historic American city, founded in 1718 by the French, eventually a part of colonial Spain, then transferred back to France, and then sold as a part of the Louisiana Purchase to the United States. So from the very beginning, New Orleans has always been this multicultural city. European influences, African influences, Caribbean influences, et cetera. So when Katrina occurred, probably one of the most visible things people saw on television were people stranded in shelters of last resort, the Convention Center and the Louisiana Superdome. Katrina exposed poverty that was a reality in New Orleans for many, many, many generations. And it shocked a lot of people who didn't know the city because they knew the city for its culture, as a wonderful place to visit, as a place of great restaurants and great architecture and a tremendously positive image. And many people said, whoa, what? Is this the New Orleans we didn't know, or is this the reality of New Orleans? The reason why I say this is 2.5 to 3 years before the Great Recession took place. And the truth is that New Orleans has always had a long-standing challenge with poverty, but it's a poverty of the working poor, because the hospitality industry, which produced a tremendous amount of jobs and some level of economic security, also produced a low-wage economy, with many people relying on public transit, subsidized apartments, public housing, and the like, but a working poor population, which was key to the economic success of the city. So now, 10 years later, New Orleans has come back. What are the factors that helped it come back? Number one, federal appropriations. And, if you will, rescue dollars that came from the federal government to the tune of almost $100 billion for the entire region. A lot of it went into broken levees. Why was there a federal appropriation? Because, fundamentally, because the federal government is immune from lawsuits. And with the kind of catastrophic engineering failure of the levees, in a normal situation, the government would have been the subject of a very significant class action lawsuit. So it was only right that the federal government appropriated money to rebuild the levees, to help rebuild public infrastructure. Number two, insurance proceeds. Many people whose houses were damaged had flood insurance or wind insurance and had an opportunity to rebuild their homes. Thirdly, the very essence and culture of the city created a rationale for its recovery. The music, the culture, the but-for, this yearning and desire of people that had been displaced, wanting to come back because of their love for the city with its great successes and its great challenges. So 10 years later, the city is a smaller city by probably 50 to 75,000. It was a city of about 500,000. Now it's the city proper. The metro area is about 1.25. And now it's a city of about 400 to 425,000. However, the region, and this is what's important, much of the displacement took place and people who stayed in the region. They went to Baton Rouge. Baton Rouge is now the largest city in Louisiana, with almost 500,000 people. They went to the suburban parishes, that's our county units of government, around New Orleans. So the suburbs have become more diverse. The city still remains diverse, still a majority people of color community. The African American community is has to some extent not as large, but still is the majority of the population of the city. There's a lot of very important lessons to be learned from both the mistakes that took place and the successes. One of the successes is that there was support from all over the country, private, nonprofit, volunteer sector, support from foreign countries that sent money to help build universities and other public infrastructure. It was a story of people from all over the world really rallying to help this historic, unique American place. Let me say this. The important thing for today is to learn from what I call the challenges of the 80s, the successes of the 1990s when we had this tremendous renaissance in America, what Katrina taught us, and also the challenges of the Great Recession. Because for the modern American city today, income inequality, wage stagnation, poverty. But on the other side, technology, the interest that the millennial generation has, where many may have grown up in the suburbs and they want to live in the city, the concept of the walking city, the concept of the city where people embrace the use of public transportation, want strong public infrastructure and public facilities. We've got to architect a future. The other thing I would say is that the city should not be seen distinctly as just the city core. It's more, cities represent the aorta of economic regions. The economic region here is not only greater metropolitan Los Angeles, but also all the way down to Southern California and perhaps into San Diego and maybe into the northern parts of the Baja region of Mexico. Cities are the drivers. I believe that cities should be the focus of public and private actors, not only at the local level, and philanthropic actors, but also at the national level, because we have to think and reimagine what cities should be. I'm keeping a close eye because I think what's happening in Saudi Arabia, I visited there about 6 years ago, building a city from scratch is probably one of the most fascinating things I've ever heard, right? And I look forward to learning from how you imagine it to how you certainly succeed with it. So there's been tremendous challenges. Katrina, there are important lessons to be learned about how things and how mistakes were made. But also there's an important lesson to be learned about human ingenuity and human desire. And even when the government failed and was stumbling and fumbling and bumbling, and the federal government, the state government, the local government fumbled, stumbled, and bumbled around Katrina in the early days of the recovery. But notwithstanding that, people took it on their own, voluntary action, nonprofit actors, community-based actors, took hold of things and have pushed to bring the city back. Notwithstanding that, poverty is still a reality. Notwithstanding that, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. But on a panel today and in a forum like this, I think we have to learn lessons, but not be overly diagnostic and get bogged down in the diagnostics, but really understand what it means to energize a future. So a lot of my thinking today and the work that we're doing today is I'm excited, for example, about sentencing reform. The idea that you're going to have this opportunity for many people who are in long sentences for drug offenses being released from prison. But I'm concerned, for example, that they'll return to communities. There will be no comprehensive effort around reentry and job training and transitional housing. And so there's got to be a focus not only on reforming sentencing, which is a good thing, but also building the kind of infrastructure we need so people can become productive citizens in communities. So we're very, very concerned about that. We're working on that issue both from a policy standpoint and also from a programming standpoint. So I appreciate the chance to be with everyone this morning, and I hope that there'll be some important lessons to be learned from what we discussed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. And I know there are already a couple of things you pointed out that I wanted to sequence actually directly to Mayor Nenshi. You know, you talked about the importance of human capital when you're talking about sentencing reform and basically bringing people back into the equation who may have been excluded. But you also made the very important point, and this was in the California context, which we always like, how do cities who are really basically macroeconomic areas, how do they work together best? So I think that's a perfect segue, Mayor Nenshi, to your unique city, one of the most dynamic cities in North America, with an urban and geographic landscape of the great, sprawling, beautiful Canadian prairie, where there's not necessarily physical barriers to further growth, even sprawl. And you know, you're dealing with issues of how to make a dynamic, livable city, but also balance that with the economics of housing and development. So give us some of the thoughts in terms of things that you and your your folks in Calgary are doing.
Well, thank you. You know, we are living in a world where for the first time in human history, the majority of the world's population lives in cities. And so this is not just a macro trend, it's a fundamental shift in how the world works. And we have to think hard about how cities work. You know, as you suggested, there are, did you say more than 100 cities in China that will grow into of the 600 largest cities in the world?
By 2025, which is not that far away, 136 new cities expected to join the top
I was
600.
invited to a tourism conference in China in a city that I had never heard of before. So I Googled, what is this place? 14 million people in a province of 147 million people. And I guarantee you none of you have heard of this city or this province unless you're from China. So clearly, urbanization is something that is happening in a very, very big way, and we have to be incredibly thoughtful about how we build those cities. So, you know, I'm lucky. I live in a city of 1.2 million people, as you say, in the middle of the Canadian prairie, few physical barriers to growth. The Economist calls us one of the 5 most livable cities in the world. We're getting something right. But I think that we have to share a lot about how we can do an even better job of building cities that are sustainable in the long run. And when I say sustainable, I mean financially sustainable, environmentally sustainable, socially sustainable. And all 3 of those things are vital to how we think about what we're building. So you mentioned sprawl.
Yeah.
So one of the first things we got to think about is, what is the physical footprint of the city? And large cities, we're here in Los Angeles, it's another example of it, that have faced few barriers to growth, tend to grow large. So Calgary, for example, is larger in geographic size than the 5 boroughs of New York City. Population 1.2 million. And that, of course, means that people are spending time commuting. It means investment in infrastructure is exponentially higher because you have to build pipes and roads to cover this geographic space, and it's difficult to have enough property tax paying citizens to cover the cost of that. But also, there's a real social cost. If people are feeling atomized and not part of their community, it is much more difficult to bring the community together. And I should say that no matter how sophisticated we are, no matter how urbane we are and how many Starbucks and cool organic food shops we have, we also are victims, I suppose, of the natural environment around us. So Katrina, of course, is a huge example. In 2013, the city of Calgary faced the costliest natural disaster in Canadian history, which was flooding in our downtown core. We're built at the nexus of 2 rivers, and they both experienced 100-year floods at the same time. And nothing like Katrina, thank goodness, but still $6 billion in damage to public and private infrastructure, and very few people had flood insurance. And so the government had to step in. And just today, a city to the north of me, where the Alberta oil sands are located in Fort McMurray, is threatened by wildfires, and they've had to evacuate the entire city. One highway, by the way. So these are things we got to think about. We got to build in resilience and sustainability through everything we do. So very briefly on urban sprawl, you know, we have to manage that in different ways. You want to encourage people to move back into the center of the city. You want people to be able to live downtown. And that really is high-rise living in the center of the city around transit nodes and train stations, getting people in there. When you're building new suburban communities, we can build them much smarter than we built them in the past. We can build them so that much of the daily necessities of life you can do without having to get into a car. Kids can walk to school, people can walk to the store. These things actually make a huge difference for environmental and social sustainability as well as financial. You also have to ensure that growth pays for itself, that the existing taxpayers are not stuck paying for interchanges and pipes and things in newer neighborhoods. The hard part is those middle neighborhoods. A neighborhood has a life cycle of about 35 years. People move in, young families, the kids grow up, they leave, and then when you get to the 30, 35-year point, you have to realize, okay, are we rejuvenating this neighborhood? What are we doing to get more young people in? How are we helping seniors age in place? Or do we manage the neighborhood's transition into something quite different? And that's the hardest part, because people love their neighborhoods. And so you really want to try and help people understand how to make those neighborhoods change over time so that they are better, and they're better places to live, and they're multi-generational, and designing them to be multi-generational from the start.
So one thing you said when we talked the other day was that sprawl is popular. sprawl is. I mean, the traditional model, at least in the U.S., of the suburban house on quarter-acre lot or eighth of an acre, it's very popular. Is it a tough dialogue either with citizens or with planning authorities to basically encourage kind of the smart growth model?
I think human beings are very rational. And we have to make sure that the incentives are correct. And it's not about saying you can't have a house with a lawn. It's not about that at all. But it is about fully costing that home, helping people make those decisions. So in Calgary, for example, for many years, before I became mayor, we were not charging suburban developers the cost of water and wastewater. Instead, we took that on in debt, and we put it on everybody's water bill.
All right.
So as a result, the city of Calgary has about $4 billion in debt, $3 billion of which is directly related to building water and wastewater infrastructure.
Wow.
So over the last 10 years, 6 years since I've been mayor, we've changed that so that the developers are now paying the full cost, which of course means people buying a new home are paying the cost. And instead of it going on everyone's water bill, it's going into people's mortgages. But someone has to pay.
Right.
But doing it that way helps people make decisions over, okay, is it worth the commute? Is it worth the little more that I'm paying, a few more $1,000s per home, in building the infrastructure, or would I rather buy an older home in an existing neighborhood and do some renovations? So building a level playing field and removing those sort of subsidies that are changing people's incentives is an important part of what we do.
What you're addressing the disincentives to basically not, to not be closer in and the incentives to be further out. So that's really important.
That's exactly.
I was going to add this point, and I think this is a phenomenon in the United States, and that is the changing family. And the changing family style changes the demand for the type of housing that people want.
Absolutely.
People may, do more sharing. They may be more willing to live in an apartment style situation. A large house with a lawn is also expensive to maintain. Right. And so there's a push, and I've noticed this in post-Katrina New Orleans with a lot of office buildings being converted, a lot of multi-family housing being built, not enough to accommodate and keep housing costs down. But I think the family and the evolution, I think we have to pay close attention to the thought processes, the lifestyle choices of the millennial generation, right? And what they want. And we really need to think about that in terms of designing the future city, because it's all about building it for them.
That's a really good point, Mark. It's not just that there aren't cookie-cutter houses, there aren't cookie-cutter households, right?
Yes.
People are different, and families are different, increasingly different. So this wouldn't be a Milken Institute Global Conference panel without an attention to the importance of finance. So Byron is, the CEO and head of Dynex Capital, which oversees more than $4 billion and
$4 billion balance sheet, plus or minus $1 billion.
Okay, good. We won't try and get the exact number, but that's pretty impressive neighborhood. And also someone who's worked in public housing finance. And so, so much of what we've already talked about addresses issues of affordability, sustainability. So Byron, how do we think about that best from a finance point of view, and especially in light of some of the changes that have happened in the housing finance market in this country?
So there's some fascinating points that have been made today, and I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible because there's so much to talk about. First question would be, how many in here would like to see their taxes increased to pay for a lot of the issues around urbanization? Okay, so no one wants their taxes increased. There are other ways. The most successful cities, urbanization is real. It's happening on every continent. The cities in China, I did a trip also about 3 years ago. The cities are massive. You look at Africa, you look at South America, you look at Europe. The cities that will be most profitable will create the most, the closest public-private partnerships, where you have the public needs and the public officials partner with private capital, such as Dynex Capital, to achieve certain goals. So here's an interesting fact. Dynex Capital, at Dynex, we have made money in affordable housing. So in the 1990s, we made loans through the government, low-income tax housing credit program. That was a program that encouraged developers to build affordable housing. At the end of the day, Dynex Capital owned the loan, and we risk managed that product for the last 15 years. So we took the risk over the last 15 years. We put our own pension at risk. We put our own capital, our own money, our family lifestyles at risk. We're an entrepreneurial company. And so we took that risk. That's a public-private partnership to achieve a goal. In this big move of urbanization, one of the number one needs will be housing. How are you going to house all these people? And you're going to need it to be multi-generational. So I think of the U.S. and I say, can the U.S. achieve success in housing that could be transported, those ideas, to other parts of the globe? So one of the mistakes that are being made is that because of 2008, there's this misperception that things around housing, things around borrowing, things around lending are all bad. They're not. There are mistakes that were made between 1998 and 2008. In my opinion, most of those mistakes came out of Washington, D.C., not out of New York and Wall Street. There is a misimpression being spread throughout the globe that Wall Street is bad, that finance is bad. This is the way we will achieve some of your goals as a mayor, is by bringing finance, bringing the cash that's available globally to some of these projects. And it can be structured in a way similar to Dynex making money in affordable housing in the 1990s, and managing ultimately via the low-income tax housing credit program. So there are more strategies that can be created, but here's the number one issue that needs to change. Stop bashing Wall Street. Whether it's Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, or Donald Trump, stop bashing Wall Street. Finance is essential for us to be able to achieve the goals that we need to achieve. Urbanization is fantastic. I grew up in the inner city of St. Louis. Let me give you an idea of what it was like. I'm the youngest of 5 kids, but we didn't own a car until probably I could have been 10, 11, or 12 years old. We took public transportation everywhere we needed to go. I worked for the St. Louis Cardinals. I worked baseball, football, St. Louis Blues hockey. I took a bus to work. I was an usher as a teenager, in high school and in college. The stadium was downtown. It was exciting. The whole city was excited about the St. Louis Cardinals. And so businesses were downtown. Shopping was downtown. And so here's a lifestyle, in my opinion, that's fantastic. I'd like to see the urban areas get back to that thought process where we're thinking about communities. We're thinking about the rapid transit such that everyone doesn't need to necessarily own a home. But at the end of the day, we've got to be able to house everyone, from the wealthiest to the poorest. And housing has to cover that entire spectrum. And the best strategy for this is to develop public-private partnerships. Don't bash finance. Bring finance into to be an answer to the problem.
So Byron, just as a follow-up on that, is the public policy gap, do you think, more at the national level, or are you seeing it as well in terms of providing the partnership, providing the leadership from a policy level? Is the need more at a national level or more at a local and state level?
It's at both, but at this point in time, we need, at the national level, in my opinion, we need a housing czar. We need housing to be elevated to a point where it is discussed, it is strategized for the country as a whole. Because what you're hearing now is you're hearing this Wall Street bashing. Right. I have traded mortgage-backed securities my entire career. I was heavily involved as an investor in the subprime sector. My dad was a subprime borrower. I've lent money to high-end borrowers and low-end borrowers. But we need, in Washington, why do you need the housing czar, right? Here, something they created after 2008 was the FSOC, right? It was trying to bring these various different groups within regulatory bodies together to deal with systemic risk. We need the exact same thing in Washington around housing, because there are various different groups within Washington that is impacting the world of housing. And someone needs to take a leadership role to say, in a well-functioning community, housing is essential, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Berlin, whether it's in Johannesburg, whether it's in Beijing.
Or Saudi Arabia.
Or Saudi Arabia. And this is a fascinating story because you're thinking about this from the beginning, right?
Exactly.
They've elevated the issue enough, and I don't know it. You'll have to explain it.
No, this is the perfect segue.
That's exactly correct. And I'm saying in Washington, we need to elevate this issue of housing and then bring private capital to the table along with the public officials to try to put forth plans that will actually work. Low-income tax housing credit program, Dynex Capital made money making affordable housing loans. That's a fact. We're an entrepreneurial company. We're 19 people with another 5 or 6 consultants, and we put our own capital at risk.
Congratulations, that's great. So Fahad, in some ways we've saved the most visionary part of this opening discussion for you, because what Emaar Economic City is doing is truly revolutionary. And it would be great, I don't know how much people in the room know about what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia embarked upon, 10 years ago with a vision. We had yesterday as one of our luncheon speakers, for those of you who were able to see the panel about ISIS, Tony Blair was part of that panel. He's a really eloquent man. He had a shout out to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, basically saying that the present government is embarking on some truly visionary and revolutionary ideas and ventures. The fact is that Emaar Economic City has been development for almost 10 years. But it's something that I don't think people around the rest of the world have really seized on, the fact that Saudi Arabia is creating an entirely new city from scratch. And so I would just love to hear, and I think everybody in the room would love to hear, what was the background of that? What is the kingdom trying to address in embarking upon this very ambitious, very costly, and very hopefully visionary venture?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be in the great city of Los Angeles. I always love coming to the US. And one of the things that I always feel when I arrive anywhere, in any airport, that I've arrived home, believe it or not. And I only lived in the US for 6 years. So I hope this never changes, because I don't feel the same anywhere in the world. What we're doing 10 years ago was King Abdullah, the late King Abdullah, he forecasted that oil prices won't remain high for a very long time, that the oil markets always fluctuate up and then down, and up and down, and cycles. So he thought, although the government was very well financed at the time, how can we engage the private sector in big scale way, a public-private partnership that would be a global innovation to do something that the kingdom needed, which is jobs and housing. And so the idea was very simple. Put together a consortium of investors that would develop a city from scratch and sell them a piece of desert that is unutilized, and Saudi is a big country, we're the size of Western Europe. Just give them a plot. So we bought a plot the size of Washington, D.C., a city that would be for 2 million people, completely private. And then they listed it on the Saudi Stock Exchange. So it is the first publicly listed city in the world. And we'll talk about the implications of governance and social equity after. And for the past 10 years, it's been a struggle, because at the beginning they called it a cartoon city. The images were just so beautiful. Nobody believed that the private sector would actually do this. For the longest time, they joked about it and said that we'd never actually achieve it. 10 years later, we are now building the largest port in Saudi Arabia. By end of this year, we will have the largest port. We have the largest, most successful industrial zone in the country. We've attracted 110 companies, pharma companies like Pfizer and Sanofi, food manufacturing companies like Mars, Johnson Controls, many of them investing for the first time, not only in Saudi Arabia, but actually in the region. And by the way, they're investing at rates that are much higher than what the government subsidized and offered at the time. We are also the largest residential developer in the country, because we did not want to miss on affordable housing or middle-income housing. We address all income segments. And now we are making a major push into making Saudi Arabia a tourism destination. I know you think I'm crazy. But we are actually the 17th most visited country in the world because of the religious tourism. We also have Saudis take 10 million trips abroad because they have very limited options locally. And so we're addressing these markets, and we're going into new ones. And the biggest success, I think, for us, and how we think about our success, it's not this hard infrastructure. This is the easy part, it turns out. Once you can finance it and get the right operations going, it just grows very fast. We're growing at 20 to 30% in every sector. It is how to unleash human potential. And I think cities, when they get that right, then they understand what their roles are. My role is not to build a city. Practically, we would lay the infrastructure, we'll build the roads, we'll put electricity in, utilities, but ultimately, it is companies, entrepreneurs, and people that invest their lives in these cities that make these cities tick. And we look at cities all around the world. I'm fascinated by cities. I can't give you one example of a perfect city that I'd want to emulate because every city has its own challenges and opportunities and fascinating aspect about it. But I look at cities that are vibrant. They might not be beautiful, but they are vibrant. You can feel their populations both interacting with each other, but creating a cultural experience that's hard to replicate anywhere else in the world. And over the next 10 years, we've built the infrastructure. Thankfully, we're very successful and commercially very successful. But I think about how do we build a community that works and how do we empower entrepreneurs and our youth? Because 65% of Saudi are youthful. And how do we get them going into an economy that works for them?
So, Fahd, you mentioned this, the social aspect, and that's what you're coming up to. So, the kingdom, as you say, is addressing the fact that it's been a petroleum-based economy for most of modern Saudi Arabia, and that was part of the vision of the creation of Emaar Economic City. That Saudi is probably going to be transitioning at some point from that. So that, as we know, those of us who try and keep up with what's going on in the kingdom and in the region and the world, with the petroleum politics and economics, that's impacting the overall Saudi economy hugely. Job creation, youth unemployment, all that. How specifically are you, as you plan the city, as you develop the city, are you addressing these human capital issues, the questions of engagement of people and getting them, is it through public-private partnerships like Byron mentioned? Is it, are you relying mainly on the private companies that you're being able to attract with some success?
So let me address two issues. Why is Saudi Arabia doing this transformation, this Vision 2030, and then address the human capital question? I think they're both very important. Oil and oil revenues blinds governments in many ways. This has happened, all around the world, and the reason is very simple. Governments want to do something. They want to show progress. And sometimes working with the private sector, it takes a long time. There are trust issues. There are publicity issues. And government it's always easier if you have money for government to just do it yourself. And that is always a big mistake because you have issues of accountability, cost management, control, operational excellence that governments, after they build an asset, they don't really look at. But as a private sector participant, you have to because you have to compete. Yeah. And so what the government is simply looking at is saying, what is the potential of this country? There is a potential of geographic, but there is also the potential of geographic location, and I'll address that, but also the potential of our people. And so on location, Saudi Arabia today straddles Africa, Asia, and Europe. In fact, we are right on the Red Sea, and the Red Sea, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most important trading routes in the world. 15% of global trade goes through it. So the potential for it is massive in terms of becoming a logistics zone. And if you look at the countries around the Red Sea, 23 countries, what we call the Red Sea market. This is a 620 million person opportunity, growing to 1.3 billion opportunity by 2050. This is a massive market. Though nobody today is looking at. It is the next emerging market in the world, competing with China and India. So we want to be a logistics hub for these countries. So that's one, on potential. The second, on human capital. So there is, on human capital, in my mind, there are two ways of looking at it. One is top-down. So what we did is we looked at all of the industries we're trying to compete in and attract, like pharma or foods or logistics. And we projected exactly how many companies and what size they would be and what income levels each one of them would have. And then we built housing units for all of the income levels. So we actually created a self-enforced quota on what we need to deliver in terms of affordable housing, labor housing, and all of that. And then we said, how do we now allow the population to empower themselves? Okay, fine, you can create jobs and they can go, but how do we let them and their families empower themselves? So we focus on education massively, and we think about the future of education and how our industries are changing very quickly. And everything must change. We're going to be much more mobile. We're going to be sharing our skills rather than being employed full-time a lot more. This is going to change the way we think about jobs and work in the future. And cities that do this, they must think about how this will change their education systems.
Well, that's a great segue to one of the things that I'd like to do here, which is pose what we call the lightning round, which is basically quick questions to a single, or quick answers to a single question. And that's what I call the magic wand question. So for each of you, if you had one wish, one thing that you would like to see happen to address an obstacle or a challenge, whether it's in your city, whether it's in the financial system, whether it's in your project, whether it's in the world at large, that you think would really drive change in the most positive way, what would your magic wand wish be?
Okay. Mark's not here, so I'm taking his. I'm giving you two.
Go for it.
One is a coherent fiscal framework that allows cities to be able to access the capital and the funds they need rather than rely on regional and national governments. The second is around civic engagement. It's around helping citizens really feel that they are part of a community and that they can use their own hands and voices to build that community. This number 3 I'm wearing is about a simple social movement, which is called 3 Things for Calgary. You're welcome to steal it. It's completely open source, which is just a simple movement that encourages every citizen every year to do 3 things for their community. It's about building a lifetime of service to your community and about building that real belonging and that skin in the game in the community, and that's where real miracles happen.
That's great. Thank you. Byron, what's your magic wand
I want
wish?
some of this. I want some of this out of Washington. A visionary thought process that recognizes that for a community to be successful, we must think about our housing. Now, you got to think about more than just that, but you're only giving me one, so I'm going to pick the one, which is around housing. And just to be clear with you to understand what Dynex does, we invest. We ultimately lend money not only to homeowners but also to multifamily property. So we're in the rental markets and we're into the real estate homeowner market, and we're also in the commercial market, which then comes back to community. Right. So this visionary thought process out of Washington, which I think it actually takes a housing czar of some sort to match up kind of this vision where we're thinking down the road, and how do we then bring public-private partnerships together to achieve these goals.
There's no magic wand here, I'm telling you, it's all hard work. Okay. And I want to address it from 2 perspectives, because I think as a new city, we have both an opportunity but a responsibility to do things differently. The one is on master planning. And this is a lesson I learned very, very the hard way. In 2005, we have a very well-known and prominent US design firm design our master plan. It was a beautiful master plan, I have to say. Canals everywhere. It was a Venice of the future in Saudi Arabia, where we had no water. It was inspirational.
They did in Las Vegas.
But then I was in New York during Hurricane Sandy, and I realized that we have been over-engineering our cities and putting too much concrete everywhere and not respecting the environment. And this is really dangerous, and this is some of what's happening in these examples, where the city infrastructure could not just put up with nature.
Right.
And then I went back and I took a very hard look at what we've been doing. And apparently, we've been taking these, storm drainage areas that are natural, that basically nature has built for us, covering them up, then dredging them, putting concrete everywhere, and reducing a 100-year flood strategy into a 10-year flood strategy. Mm-hmm. We were building a 10-year flood protection. Mm-hmm. And so I just didn't understand why we were doing that. So we actually scrapped that master plan. We reintroduced these flood wadis, as we call them, as public spaces. We have now 100 miles of walking trails in the city. And for us in Saudi, you really have to understand, I spend 18 hours a day in an office or home, air-conditioned environment. We were, over time, actually, we came up in no air conditioning, but now we all live in air conditioning. So we don't have access to our cities anymore. So we changed that. And guess what? It was a win-win. We actually had more land to develop. So the city now is more than 100-year flood protected, and there was much more public space. So respecting nature is very important in that sense. But now In 2014, we are now actually started re-looking at what the city would look like in the future. Because I really think we are building a 20th century city. We don't know what a 21st century city needs to look like. The driverless cars, Internet of Things, and the sharing economy will change the way we interact with our cities and our conception of how our cities should operate. What the answer to this is, I don't know. The second comment I will make is, okay, fine, you master planned and built a great city, is governance. I think the governance of cities globally, we're doing something wrong. It is just wrong. There are 247,000 cities and towns around the world, and most of them are badly managed. And there are many ways of governing cities, but you have the elections, which is more of representation, which is great, but you also have appointments. And I would love to see statistics on the difference between the two. Does an appointment produce better results or less better results, both on social equity but also on economic progress, than an election cycle? I don't say this because I'm coming from Saudi Arabia, but we're really thinking very hard about how we as a city developer, owner, can hand over the city ultimately to the ultimate owners, which are the residents of these cities. So we're actually applying the most ubiquitous form of democracy in the world, the most best governed form of democracy in the world, which is the corporation, to this model. We've separated the development and ownership from the operation. We're creating basically a voting system where you will have, as an owner in the city, a vote in a general assembly where you elect a board, and that board can then select a CEO that could be fired anytime. There are no 4-year election cycles. The feedback loop is much faster. I also don't want to be that CEO because I want to keep my job.
Can I just add one piece here? On this governance issue, as a lender, and you mentioned earlier about $3 billion in debt, I think it's really important to understand that when a city or a country or a local area borrows money, I represent the saver, and I'm the one investing in those bonds. I want my money back, period. And so city officials must respect the fact that if I'm lending you money, it's someone's savings. It's someone's savings. So Puerto Rico is now defaulting on their debt, right? Well, it's someone's savings. Let's put a face on these dollars. It's just not dollars for a city official to just, oh, I borrowed this money, I'm going to go do this. No, we want our money back. And I'm an old school lender. I expect, I won't break your knees, but I expect my money back.
I'm not sure I want to take my chances.
The way you say it, it's scary. You know, I want my money back.
But this is relevant to what you were saying before, which is, you know, you asked the question, who wants to raise their taxes? There are other ways. In the end, it's all taxes. Because whether you lend me the money or I borrow it on the markets myself, or I raise taxes to pay for it, I got to pay it back with interest. And the only way I have to do that is to pay taxes. So one of the most interesting questions that we have, you know, I was at a thing recently where GE was talking about how with their clients, they're transforming lighting from a capital expenditure to a service. So you pay for it over time, which makes sense in the private sector because you have revenue that you can book that against. For government, that's exactly the opposite of what I want, because capital money is actually easier to come by than operating money. And if I borrow the money from you up front, then the repayments have to be on my operating side, which means I got to increase taxes to do it. So we've got to find that right balance. That's why I said my magic wand has to do with the fiscal framework that allows governments, city governments, to have the flexibility to get that right.
Well, one of the things that's come up in a number of panels here at the conference the last couple of days is basically, especially those focused on infrastructure, is that we have a unique opportunity now with relatively low, very low, historically low interest rates to basically finance public infrastructure projects that would have been prohibitive. And maybe that's partly what you're able to tap into in Ymar Economic City. But is that something that you folks think is an opportunity for either your cities or the world at large in terms of, do we have a great infrastructure finance need that we, at least in the United States, are maybe being a little bit slow in recognizing the opportunity?
Well, you know, I hope that people here at the Milken Institute believe in efficient capital markets. I do.
We do.
I do too.
And if you believe that capital markets are efficient, then the NPV of a public-private partnership vis-a-vis a purely public investment is always zero. It has to be zero. So then the question becomes, well, when do the PPPs make sense? They make sense when governments don't have access to capital, or where government's cost of borrowing is prohibitive, which is not really the case in most Western democracies. They make sense if governments are really risk averse and they would rather have a private operator take on the risk of failure rather than government having to take on that risk. Or they make sense if you believe that government is so inefficient at either building or operating assets that the cost of that inefficiency is greater than the return on investment for the private investor. Any of those things can be true. But I think that they're not the panacea because, as I said before, even if you have a private investor in place, unless you have an innovative way of paying it back, you got to pay it back. So, I mean, we were talking earlier about making money on affordable housing, and you said something really, really smart. Because I asked the question, well, if you're charging below market rents, how does the investor make its money back? And well, why don't you say what you said? You said it all depends on how you define market. Right.
Well, that's true. And not only that piece, but when there's a low income tax housing credit program, there were tax credits, right? That simply reduces the cost of the process of building. There's a lot of regulations that are increasing costs. And so let's start with that point to say we need affordable costs for this housing. So are there costs built in the whole process from building affordable housing all the way back to the lender that we can squeeze out of the process? And then in lies where the tax credit. And then I took the risk on. We had bonds, we had loans, and for everyone who wants to know about the mortgage market, we issued non-agency mortgage-backed securities that were very successful and they were fine, and we had skin in the game, which is what they're trying to legislate today, and we did it without legislation. So we had skin in the game in that process. So there are costs that can come out, and that's what you're seeking to do. But you do need the private and you need the public and the private guys sitting at the table to figure out how to make this happen. The reason I talk about the housing czar is just to elevate the issue to a point where we say this is really important for a community, which is what you're saying you want to build. This is very important. Let's see if we can't put our heads together around this. The issue of low interest rates, there's an enormous amount of cash globally right now seeking a decent return. And we should try to take advantage of that fact to tap into that capital. For the most part, again, put a face on the capital. It's a person with savings who simply wants a return and they want their money back. But emphasize, they want their money back. Right? So that, and so let's just try to create, get the right governance in place, because that's essential when you're borrowing money, and the right ideas in place such that it can be paid back. And I'm certain the ideas are there to solve many of these issues, but I do think it takes that visionary thought process around these issues.
Well, and we're going to go to, in just a couple of minutes, we're going to go to you folks to ask some questions. We have time for that. We want to get your thoughts as well as your questions. But just to tee up one thing that's been teased out a little bit here, we talked about finance, we've talked about planning and development as a government and public-private partnership. But one thing that's come up a couple places here is the role of technology. And so, again, one of the great things about being able to have a panel on the third day of the global conference is we can reference and talk about some of the insights from the previous 2 days. On a Monday, some of you may have heard Eric Schmidt. Oh, great.
You're back.
Mark, you're back.
Back.
Thank you. And he can take part.
I'm back.
Great. Eric Schmidt referenced the fact that one of the things that he thinks is very hopeful for the future of humankind is that we will be able to have virtual printing, 3D printing of housing.
Yep.
Which, when I heard that, I thought I never could imagine that. But it's like the technology possibilities across the board. Yesterday, there was a panel which talked about among other things, the Hyperloop technology, which is being looked at here in California, the possibility that we'll have a tube that will shoot people from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. As someone said to me afterwards, yeah, but the real question is, will they come back in a tube? But the point is the technology, Internet of Things, all the things that are out there and tremendously hopeful. So I just want to ask the group quickly, what are the things, and obviously this is something you're at the cutting edge of in creating a new city. How are you seeing and how are the others seeing the role of technology and technological innovation powering the future you want? What are some of the specific things that you're most excited by?
Well, let me tell you that we've had a ride with technology. For the past 8 to 10 years, everybody's been talking about smart cities.
Yes.
And we actually don't see them implemented. In fact, there's a movie that's been made about our experience with smart cities called Hologram to the King. Tom Hanks.
Oh, Tom Hanks.
Yeah.
He was here too.
Most people don't understand what smart city is. I don't understand what smart city is. But I have come to this conclusion that it is actually a three-layered issue. Number one is how, as a city administrator, do you see the city? So it is that dashboard of how your utility systems operate, how your transport and your security systems operate. But then there is the citizen layer. That's the most important one. How does a citizen run the city? Because everybody has a mobile phone today. How can we actually literally hand over the city to somebody who is constantly supervising your streets, ensuring that they're clean, that the potholes are safe? They're protecting their families, typically. So how can we give them empowerment through technology to do this, but also to interact with each other and to give you a lot more data about what they want and what they don't want? That I think about a lot. The third is the easy one, which is the unit layer, at the unit of the home. Is that a smart home? Because most of your problems actually start at the home. Your energy efficiency starts there because people don't understand how much they're using energy, how much they're wasting in water. And so if we give them these tools, they will make the rational decisions that we talked about earlier about how to best utilize resources.
Are you allowing that to be basically done at the private level, or are there regulations and mandates that require, as housing units are created in a more economic city, that there be smart technology embedded in housing?
Yeah, we are actually also giving examples of how you could do it cheaply. So we're actually suggesting different systems that link up to the city. But the idea is to keep the system and the models all open so that people can tap into them and create new apps that people can leverage over time. So it can't be a closed circuit system.
Thank you, Tom.
So, we're building cities the same way we've been building cities for 150 years in the West. And technology, such as it is, has helped us in little ways, synchronize the streetlights better, things like that. What we really need to understand is two things. One is around construction, the other is around human behavior. And will technology actually change how people interact with their city, how they move through the city, how they commute to work? We always thought if we were having this conference 15 years ago, we'd say, well, everyone's going to telecommute and work from home. And what we've actually learned is that communications technology actually mean people need even more face-to-face interaction. And so things have shifted. But, for example, let's talk about autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. I believe that self-driving cars will change everything and will change nothing. Because certainly when you have self-driving cars, you can make much better use of your existing transportation, and this is all assuming it works, much better use of your existing transportation infrastructure, fewer vehicle accidents, much less cost. But because of that, you're going to have cars driving kids to school instead of parents driving kids to school. You're going to have cars driving people downtown and then driving back home to park so they don't have to pay for expensive parking downtown. And so you're going to actually have so much more induced demand on your roads that the increased network capacity isn't going to help that much. So these are things that we just have to get our heads around and figure out how people are going to change their moving and their behaving. Demographics are important to this as well as technology. I want to talk just about the 3D printing for a second. This is really interesting because, to your point, there are 4 costs in building: cost of land, cost of construction, cost of financing, cost of regulation. And if I want to build affordable housing, say, I can't do much about the cost of land unless I have city land I can vend in. Cost of construction of an affordable housing unit is exactly the same as the cost of construction of a big mansion. Granite countertops are marginal once you build a foundation. Cost of regulation, of course, we can work on. Cost of financing, as we've said, is lower than it's ever been. The one we've never really looked at is cost of construction. Right. And there are lots of 3D printing just extrudes liquid. Concrete is a liquid. So if you can figure out how to make that work and you can build a house in a day instead of 6 months, it massively changes the housing equation. It makes housing much more affordable in the long term and helps us think in a very different way about housing. So that's one I'm very excited about.
Do you actually feel that is not just technologically possible, but on the horizon within the next 10 to 15 years?
I was sitting down 2 years ago with a bunch of large developers across the US, and they felt that it was 5 years away.
Really? We need it in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's open it up to questions. So we've got mics right over here.
I have the Mike.
If you could just address your question to either the panel as a whole or an individual you'd like to have it addressed.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm Carol Kretschmann, and I represent the Peacemaker Corps, and we're a non-governmental organization at the United Nations. And one of the mandates that have been given to us, because we try to create a safer city. We're trying to create a way to deal with youth and keep them from their violence. And so I'm working with UN Habitat. And Habitat has 77 safer cities that they're working on around the world. And we're trying to figure out how to do it here in the United States. I didn't hear, everything you've said is really where we're visionary looking to be. But how are you going to keep our cities safe in the new millennium?
Can I just answer one thing? I'm not the mayor, so I'm going to let you guys go, but I'm going to just make this point because this is a big one with me. I don't like crime, and I have a huge issue with this. And I grew up in the inner city of St. Louis, and I watched it evolve over the years. So I've gone to Detroit a couple of times because I think it's fascinating what they've done with Quicken Loans coming into Detroit, buying up multiple buildings. And they put cameras on every coast. So they said, if you're going to be downtown, you're going to be watched. I love that idea. But they told me that they got some flack and some pushback around this idea. So from a crime, I hate crime. I think it's such a problem in our community, and it's one of the first breakdowns of this issue. It leads to income inequality. I don't want to go off on that far, but I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about how it impacted my family and the value of my dad's home because of crime. So I like video technology as just one route for doing that. I like the fact what they did do in Detroit and putting video cameras everywhere around. I hate crime. I think we need to take an attitude, a very, very just angry attitude toward crime. And to be honest with you, the police did not create the issue in my neighborhood in St. Louis. The property values went down not because of the police. The property values went down partially because of the crime issue, along with education and a bunch of other stuff. But crime's a problem.
So this is part of the human capital equation in the communities that we're trying to build.
So I'll give you some, so it's interesting. So don't be shocked. In the United States, crime is down. However, gun crimes are higher. Severe, violent shootings, gun crimes are more severe today than they were 20 years ago, right? More shootings, more deaths. Burglaries, robberies, those are down. We've populated the prisons of America with about 50% of the people being nonviolent drug offenders. Possession, small-time distributors, and the like. So when it comes to where we are today, guns, gun violence, the fear of gun violence, both homicides and suicides are unacceptably high in this country. I'll say that. Number two, 100 years ago, one of the ways we kept the children of America busy was through child labor. 13, 14, 15-year-olds worked in factories. If they grew up in a rural setting, they worked on farms. We pushed away from that and said, let's focus on developing kids through a public instruction or public education system. One of the big challenges is that we've not mustered the will to understand the necessity of investing in children. So I put it very simply, right? If we can spend $60 billion rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure of Baghdad, your and my taxpayer dollars, why can't we spend $3 to $5 billion giving young people an employment opportunity in a summer youth employment opportunity here in the United States every single summer? We have to invest and give confidence. If you are a middle-class parent in America and you can afford it, you will pay money for your child to go to dance, to music, to camp, to sleepaway camp. If you're a middle-class parent with some connections, when your child gets to be 16 or 17 and they want a work experience, you're gonna pick up the phone. and you're going to open a door for them, right? That's the reality. If you're not, you're scuffling for a fast food job. You're trying to, so we have to invest in our young people, not only in education, but in creating wholesome opportunity. We have to create a magnet away from street life. The street life is attractive in a vacuum. The idle mind is a devil's workshop. This is an important question, not only in the United States, but all over the world. And I really believe that in the context of discussing the future, we have to pay close attention to not only the millennials, but the generation coming behind them and what their real world challenges are and what the opportunity. We have to invest, not just public, private, and philanthropic. And I really believe that we have to do it even more. Now, I think that that magnet is the best hedge, long-term hedge against people falling into criminal activity, lives of crime, the drug economy, guns and shootings, all of the troublesome realities that affect our young people today. So what is the point? The point is some things are issues of priorities and choice. And we have to recognize that for some things, the benefits, like a summer youth employment program, may not be immediate, but they're certainly long-term.
Do you want to come in on this?
Just very, very, very quickly, my former police chief, who's recently retired, used to have a PowerPoint slide that he would show to people, the ugliest PowerPoint slide you've ever seen in your life. And it showed what the police do. And on the bottom right-hand corner, it said, we catch bad guys and put them in jail. And everything else was all the stuff we do to prevent the bad guys from becoming bad guys and doing that work. And it's incredibly important for us to work with communities to build community resiliency to ensure that crime is seen as a last resort. So when you see police officers in full uniform playing hockey with kids who are recently arrived from refugee camps in the Middle East, it's really about helping people who may have come from a place where the police are seen as an oppressive state mechanism to see the police as part of their community. And the police, of course, are just a tiny part of the whole thing. But it's all about building ties within communities to ensure that everyone feels safe on every single street all the time. And you're right, crime is significantly down in most of the Western world. I'm Canadian, so I don't understand gun crime in the US. I struggle to understand it. But that is a lot to do with different sociological and demographic factors. But to me, the fundamental heart of the situation is if you feel like you live in a community and you belong in a community and you look after the neighbors in the community, that's what makes a difference.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I think actually it's here in the back.
Hi, good morning. Great insights by everybody. And this kind of bounces off some of the things that you guys have mentioned and the experiences that you have recalled. The largest displacement of people since World War II is the people leaving Syria and probably Iraq too. I was kind of curious what vehicles or financial or solutions you guys would recommend in the region or abroad to kind of address that problem. I think Pope Francis is advocating like using underutilized monasteries and churches, and I think he took 2 families in the Vatican, but I was wondering if you guys have already started kind of thinking about those solutions.
It's a great question. Basically, how we can address the refugee and human migration issues on a global and regional scale.
Sure. So cities have always been and need to be places of sanctuary, places of welcome, and places that welcome people from around the world of every different tradition. So I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I can go on it forever. I am tremendously proud of the Canadian government for making a commitment and sticking to that commitment, and bringing those families in has been something that hits us at cities. We've got to find housing. We've got to assist in language training. We have to ensure that there's job training that is appropriate. It turns out that many of the folks coming from Syria to Canada, and we're accepting in Canada as many as the United States is accepting, by the way, to the United States, great shame as far as I'm concerned. So we've had 1,300 Syrian refugees come in a period of 8 weeks in Calgary, for example. And what we found is a lot of them are middle income, a lot of them are reasonably well educated, but there's not a great tradition of English language learning in that country. So there's a lot of language training that has to happen. We have to get people on their feet. But all I want to say is that there was a big debate, and then after Paris happened, there was a big debate in Canada about security and whether to accept these people and so on. But as soon as they started to come, the public conversation shifted 180 degrees. And the only question I ever hear is the question that I call the most Canadian of questions, which is, how can I help? And it really is around people in communities, driving folks to medical appointments, showing them how to use the public transit system, ensuring they're welcome. I'll tell you this very, very, very quickly. I was at a big community forum on Syrian refugees. I was terrified at what kind of things would be said, where people would come, and it turned out to be just a beautiful thing. A woman stood up at the back and she said, Mayor Nenshi, I've got a problem. And I said, what's your problem? And she said, I'm a member of the Siksika Nation. I am a proud First Nations Indigenous Canadian. And I thought she was going to continue by saying, and we have so many problems at home, why are we accepting all these people? I was ready to answer that question. And she said, no, my problem is this. I have found enough elders who have the proper regalia. I found a bunch of young guys who are willing to do the drumming, but I don't know when the families are coming. Wow. And I looked at her and I said, I don't understand. And she said, these people have been through so much. We can't even describe what they've been through. And as they come here to start their new lives as Canadians, it is incredibly important that we welcome them with proper ritual and proper ceremony. That's what humanity is, as far as I'm concerned.
And that is a fantastic note to, I think, end this great discussion on. I want to thank all our panelists. Thank you so much.
Excellent job, man.
Thank you for coming.